Hey, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Kyle. I'm a part of the team here at Bridgeway, and I'm just glad that you're here. I'm glad that we're all together today. As you might know, each week we come together and we sing songs about Jesus, and we remember him through communion. And usually around this point of the sermon or the service, we open the Bible and we read from God's Word together, and that's what we're going to do today. So if you have a Bible, please open with me to Hebrews chapter 4. That's going to be our main text for today. Now, usually at Bridgeway, we like to kind of go through each verse slowly and sort of build the passage brick by brick, but today we're going to do the opposite. I'm going to read for you a good portion of Scripture today, and then we're going to kind of step back and look at three big questions that this passage raises and answers for us. So please open with me in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. It says this: God's promise of entering his rest still stands. So we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news, that God has prepared this rest, has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listened to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. As for the others, God said, in my anger, I took an oath that they will never enter my place of rest, even though this rest has been ready since he made the world. We know it's ready because the place of the Scriptures where it mentions the seventh day. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. But in the other passage, God said, they will never enter my place of rest. So God's rest is there for people to enter. But those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted. Today, when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them this rest, God would not have spoken about another day of rest still to come. So there is a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors, just as God did after creating the world. So let us do our best to enter into that rest. But if we disobey God as the people of Israel did, we will fall. For the word of God is alive and powerful. It's sharper than the sharpest two-edged sword, cutting between soul and spirit, between joint and marrow. It exposes our innermost thoughts and desires, and nothing in all of creation is hidden from God. Everything is naked and exposed before his eyes, and he is the one to whom we are accountable. Let's pray this morning. God, thanks for your word. Thank you that it is a gift from you to us, and as we've just read, it's a gift that exposes our innermost thoughts and desires. And so, God, today, as we open your word, we want to do so with humble hearts. We want to do so with just an attitude of openness, of responsiveness to whatever it is that we read in Scripture today. And we ask that you would help us who have placed our faith in you to be equipped and empowered by the Spirit to live out what it is we read. And we ask all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So as the writer of Hebrews likes to do, he is making a whole bunch of assumptions about you and me and what we know about the Bible, in particular the Old Testament. Now, at the beginning of that passage, there's a lot of us's and them's and little shorthand allusions that our author here assumes that we know and we can instantly incorporate into what he has just said. Now, the problem is, for most of us, we are not totally saturated in the story of the Old Testament, and we don't know our Hebrews scriptures intimately. And so for us, in order to get the big picture of what Hebrews is trying to communicate, what this passage is all about, we have to have an understanding and really an appreciation for the bigger story that he is alluding to. And now when it comes to any kind of narrative, I think for us, this is just kind of a human being thing, that we look in stories for patterns and sort of big themes that help us to understand what's happening in this story. And that's really important for the story of Israel, because in this particular case, The story of Israel is going to serve as an analogy for really our story as individuals or as the church today. And so before we begin to answer three of these questions that this passage raises, we need to understand the story that the writer of Hebrews is using to help convey this point. And so, here it is. This is the story. So we're going to talk about these five big themes. And first of all, we see that all stories begin with a people or a person. Now, these people have a problem. Okay, the problem then leads to some sort of redemption. That's what we're going to call that today. Redemption. Okay. Next, after redemption, we have what I'm going to call tension. Tension, and then finally, the story resolves with promise. Now, for the story in the Old Testament that our author is invoking today, we begin with the people, and you might have already beat me to this part. The people is the people of Israel. Now, when we first are introduced to the people of Israel, they have a very obvious problem, which is that they are slaves in Egypt. Right? They're under the power of Pharaoh, which is the Egyptian kings, and they're being mistreated horribly. Now, in the story, as we start to read into the Old Testament, we see that God raises up Moses to save the people of Israel, and we see this story is played out in the book of Exodus. So we have redemption here through Moses and how God brings his people out of Egypt. But then let's jump ahead to the promise. Now, this is really concrete in Israel's story because they're literally going to a place of promise. And this land, in fact, it's a land, it's called the land of Canaan. It's called the Promised Land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a place that you want to be. But the problem is, if you can think about this story, right, we see this happens in Egypt where they are, right, we see the plagues happen and all this incredible drama that plays out. But then after they leave Egypt, they don't just walk next door and walk into the Promised Land. To get to Canaan, you have to walk through it's literally a wilderness. And this is where the drama of the story of Exodus really takes place. Of course, it's a dramatic story for them to be rescued out of Egypt, but really this is where the rubber meets the road. Because now we're wondering, are they going to make it to the Promised Land? What's going to happen? Are they going to encounter danger on the way? How are they going to be sustained through the journey? And if we can imagine having never come to the Bible, just wondering what's going to happen to the people of Israel. And there's a place of tension here where there is a journey between the redemption that's secured in Egypt and the ultimate promise that is going to be found in Canaan. Now sadly, if you're familiar with this story, we learn that the people of Israel, at least the people of Moses' generation, they fail to enter the Promised Land. Because in the wilderness, all sorts of things go wrong for them. They worship other gods. They complain against Moses. And God says that you will not enter into the ultimate promise that I have for you. In fact, we see this play out in Hebrews chapter 3. We see this wilderness journey here ends in disaster for the generation that left Egypt. And so it's important that we have this story because the author of Hebrews is asking us to draw a comparison and an analogy between the people of Israel and you and me. Now sometimes when we come to the Old Testament in particular, we can spiritualize and allegorize and personalize the way the Old Testament in a way that was never meant to be used. For instance, David and Goliath, you are not David, your problems are not Goliath, okay? However, Hebrews is asking us to do precisely this with the story of Israel. And so now the people of Israel are really, we're to think of this through the lens of you and me. That's a me, not a moo. You and me. I knew this was a bad idea. You and me. And just remember that a lot of people actually believe that Hebrews was a sermon. Now, I find this to be really compelling because there's certain aspects of Hebrews that don't feel like a letter at all. It feels like a pastor is getting up in front of a church and he's speaking directly to them. And so let's not remember here that I know that Christians and Christianity, sometimes we can make that an abstraction, and it's really, really amazing that Christians and people of faith are united by space and time, by their belief in the gospel. But let's just kind of get the sense of what is happening in Hebrews. This pastor is looking out into a sea of faces, and maybe even a living room full of faces, probably a small house church. Which means that he's not talking about some abstract idea. He's talking about you. He's looking at you. He knows your name. He knows who your family is. He knows your story. He knows what you're struggling with. And so this is who he is speaking to when he talks about us. It's not some vague idea. It's Mike. It's David. It's Laurel. And he's looking at these people, and he wants us to understand that this is our story too. So moving along, we have a people now, right, which is us, but instead of slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt, we have our problem, which is this: sin. Now, when we look at our story, when we think about redemption as Christians, we don't think about Moses and the Exodus story. We see, rightly, that Jesus and the cross is what accomplishes our redemption. Now, jumping ahead to the very end here, we're going to see that for Hebrews, when we think of promise, you've probably already filled in the blank with heaven or resurrection, but actually for Hebrews, for this particular passage, he clarifies the promise as this: rest. In fact, rest is the exact same word that's used to describe the ultimate promise that the people will find in Canaan. In Joshua 21 and 24, God says, I will give them rest. And so in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see this idea of rest is absolutely central. What about this part? For believers, there is a tension that we live in each and every day. And really this tension is because we find ourselves between, on one hand, we live in the shadow of the cross, right? And what Jesus did for us here and how he redeemed us. But we also live between this tension of not realizing the full sense of the promises of God for us. And scholars and theologians and pastors have come up with a term that helps us to understand this in terms of the kingdom, and it's this phrase. It's the already, but not yet. Already, but not yet. This area of tension that we live in, because on one hand we can look at our lives and we say, okay, I've been redeemed by Jesus, like Jesus has done something for me, yet I'm not automatically experiencing the full promise and the full rest that Scripture seems to promise us. And we can say this individually, of course, because notice that when you made some commitment to follow Jesus, you didn't just immediately go teleport to some sort of place of ultimate rest. You got to get up and wake up the next morning. You got to go to your job. And so we find ourselves there individually, but also in terms of redemptive history, we see that the cross is the climactic moment of history, but it has not fully been consummated in the restoration of all things being made new. And so it's this right here, this tension, that the writer of Hebrews seems to be so concerned with. Right? He's looking at people who are struggling in their faith, many of them who have drifted away from the gospel, either by complacency, and for some people, they've actually begun to follow different teachings and different gospels altogether. And so what he's concerned about here is how is it that we live this part out well? Right? If the whole goal here is to enter into this rest, we know that the people of Israel, at least in this first kind of iteration of the promise, they didn't enter into the promise, but he wants that for us. And so what we have here is a passage that is all about God's rest. And specifically, this passage is going to raise and answer 3 questions about God's rest. And let's jump into the first one, which is, of course, what is God's rest? Like, when the writer of Hebrews talks about rest, what exactly is he getting at? And again, don't fill in the blank, because there is a very specific answer that Hebrews gives us, and we find it in verse 3. It says, "This rest has been ready since he made the world, being God. We know it is ready because of the place in the scriptures where it mentions the 7th day." Then he quotes from Genesis 2, "On the 7th day, God rested from all of his work." In fact, we see that that's a partial quotation. The rest of that quotation goes like this: "And God blessed the 7th day, and he declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all of his work of creation." You know, many of us, when we think about creation, some of us, when we think about, especially the culminating act of God's creative work, we would point to humanity as God's crowning achievement, right? He creates us as image bearers after all. He creates us and he places us in a position of dominion and authority. And so many of us would say, well, yeah, that's clearly kind of the high point. I actually have a friend back in the Northwest. He is a pastor and a theologian who lives in Portland. And I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but I assure you, there are a few. He wrote a book. His name's A.J. Swoboda, and he wrote a book called The Subversive Sabbath. And it's really a beautiful exploration of what it means to have rest. But he begins his book with just an interesting observation. He says, okay, if God creates in the course of 7 days, he creates humanity on the 6th day. So he says, well, isn't that interesting? That as far as humanity is concerned, day 1 begins with rest. It's kind of a beautiful picture, isn't it? You know, just think about rest for us and how we approach rest. When do you get to rest? I should say, when have you earned the right to rest? The last day. You've earned the right to rest after you've sweated it out at the job for 8 to 10 or 12 hours. You've earned a period of rest after a long week of work. But actually, in the garden, we have to just imagine this through the eyes of Adam and Eve. You know, I don't know how this worked, but at some point they wake up and they're all of a sudden in this garden. And in this garden, their creator, God, who they call Yahweh, somehow is able to walk with them, and I don't know what that means. But as Yahweh is introducing Adam and Eve to his creation, he says, look what I've made for you. Look at this garden. And this garden I've created obviously to glorify myself, but I've created it for your joy. I've also created you in my image. And I've asked you and tasked you with the purpose of reigning and ruling this great creation as my representative. And you're gonna be fruitful. I'll let you find out what that means soon. You're gonna multiply, you're gonna fill the earth, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful place I've created. But first, before you start organizing and ordering the creation, I want you to rest. Rest is the first thing that humanity ever experiences on the earth. And really this idea of rest, it's so expansive, it's so beautiful because it's representative of a perfect creation, of perfect relationship between humanity and God, between humanity and one another, and even some commentators have realized between humanity and itself, because it was an existence with no shame, with no internal strife. It's literally what we were made for. We were made for this rest. And it is out of that rest, notice that the rest of the work and all of the good things that happen, like subduing and filling it, it is out of a place of rest that all of that occurs, not the opposite. See, many of us, we have to, we work so that we can rest. In this reality, we rest and then we work from a place of rest. And so what do we see here? What I want to suggest is that this is a perfect picture of God's grace. Right? Verse 10 says this. It says, all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors. This is a rest of grace where God says that when you enter into my rest, when you live in this environment, you are existing in a place of grace where you are free. Like what's the labor that we're free from? I don't think Hebrews has your 9 to 5 in mind. I think what he has in mind here is rest from the labor of human achievement. From resting from trying to earn your way into God's favor. Rest from legalism and religiosity and all of the things and all the trappings that we have created as humanity, hoping that if we do them, we'll get back to God. God says, no. When you enter into my rest, I give you rest from that. You don't have to run in the rat race. You can get off the hamster wheel. That is the picture of rest that Hebrews has. Then the next question is, what is rest? The next question is, when can we enter this rest? And the answer is really, really simple, and it's really, really good. Verse 7, so God set another time for entering his rest, and that time for rest is today. See, this is one of the important places of divergence between the story of Israel and the story of us, so for believers. For Israel, they have to rest. They have to wait to rest till they get to the land of Canaan. For believers, it's both simpler and more complicated. For believers, we actually see that rest happens today. The possibility is here and now for rest. We don't have to wait till the end, whatever you want to call that, when you die or at the end of time. We don't have to wait for that rest. Hebrews tells us that we can experience rest right here, right now. But we also see that it's more complicated. Verse 9 says, so there's also a special rest still waiting for the people of God. Right? There's two whens. It is right here, right now. It is also then and there as well, which brings us back to this again, the tension of living in this place where the author of Hebrews wants us to not only start well, but he wants us to finish well, but it all happens right here. This tension between the here and now and the then and there. But the good news, notice, of this message, right? And it is literally the gospel. When he says the good news at the beginning of the passage, it's literally the gospel. And the gospel, the reason why it is good news, among other things, is that it is a message for today. Which then leads us to our third question, right? What is rest? When can we enter it? The final question, which maybe you're thinking about, is, well, how do I enter this rest? Right? How do we get back to things, the way that things were intended to be? How can I get back to doing what I was made to do, which was to rest in God's grace? Well, let's look at how not to do it to start. Verse 11 says, but if we disobey God, as the people of Israel did, we will fall. Now, the word disobey is actually translated from the Greek word apatheia, which you probably recognize. It's a sense in which that disobedience, and this is important for us because sometimes when we hear the word disobey, we can almost reduce this down to, well, I did something wrong and now God doesn't like me anymore. And that couldn't be farther from the truth of the gospel. However, the writer of Hebrews, and that word disobey, really is indicative of a general disposition. Right? Apathy is not an act. It's a way of life, and it's a way of relating to God where it says, God, I'm going to disregard, right? Disobedience, disregard, disbelief. Those are all patterns of behavior and a way of relating to God, which says ultimately, if we embody that kind of attitude of apathy and of disobedience, it says we will fall. What does fall mean? Figure that out for yourself. It's ambiguous. Whatever it means, I don't want to experience that. I don't want you to experience that, and neither does the author of Hebrews. In fact, that's why he's writing this letter. That's why he's preaching this sermon, is it so that the people in front of him will not fall. We also see, this is even more clear, frankly, at the end of chapter 3. Right, we see that there are three rhetorical questions that the author of Hebrews asks, and it's all about the people of Israel. He says, who was it that rebelled against God? And we just said, that's Israel, okay? Who made God angry for 40 years? That was Israel. And whom to it was God speaking when he took an oath that he would never enter their rest? That's all Israel. But verse 19 of chapter 3 is the crux of it. It says, so we see that because of their unbelief, they were not able to enter into his rest. It's right there. How not to enter God's rest, if you're curious, it's probably not why you came to church today, but in case you're wondering, the way to not enter God's rest is through unbelief. In fact, here, that's why we see the people not entering into Canaan. They did not believe. They disobeyed. They had a general apathy towards God, and it resulted in them failing to enter into Canaan. So if unbelief is the way we fail to enter into God's rest, you're probably beating me to the punch here. Let's read in verse 1 through 3 how we enter. God's promise of rest still stands. So we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us. That's the gospel, by the way, just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listen to God. And here it is. For only we who believe can enter his rest. Right? So with Israel, they failed to enter because of disbelief. Right? We were talking about dissing God last week. Now, for the author of Hebrews, the way he tells us that we are to enter into this rest is a small word. I'm going to see if you can guess it. It is faith. Now, when you hear this word, especially if you grew up in a church culture, like you get that, like there was no reveal there, right? You might have been thinking like, oh, it's faith. And we all look at that and we say, well, absolutely. All Christians believe that it is by faith, right? How are you saved? By grace through faith. And so we say, well, yeah, amen, okay. But I want to push back on this because I want to know what that means. Like, what does it mean to have faith? Have you ever talked to someone and they kind of like threw around? I had this conversation recently with somebody, and it was a stranger, and I was wearing, I never do this, I was wearing a shirt that said Jesus on it. You know, one of those youth shirts that they made? I was wearing that, and I don't ever do that, but for some reason, the problem was I was in an argument with this person. Do you guys want to know the story? The long and short of it is, they kicked me out of my Airbnb. I drove 3 hours to Oklahoma. I set up shop. Me and Jack are hanging out, and they sell the house that I was staying in, that I had paid for, and they gave it to someone else. I know, it was outrageous. And we got kicked out of the house. I'm going to probably preach that at Christmas this year about being no room at the inn, but we'll see how it goes. And so I'm talking to. It turns out the owner of the house, people who sold the house underneath my feet, they live right next door. So I end up going and talking to them. And I'm wearing a Jesus shirt, and I'm like, I need to change my shirt. True story. I wish I didn't think that, but that's what I thought. I knocked on the door, and we start talking, and it's kind of like this crazy situation, and it's very clear that they are not going to help me at all. But then she looks at my shirt. She's like, oh, well, you're a Christian. And she said, well, I'm Christian too. Like, okay, let's just examine that for a moment. Besides the fact that they just did something really mean and kicked me out of my house. Like, are we going to accept that because I am wearing a t-shirt and because you said I'm Christian, are we just like, is that faith? And before you say, well, absolutely, that's not, we accept that as the definition for faith for 99% of everything related to Christianity. You know, many of us, we say, oh, well, I've got a t-shirt, I say the right things, or I have some loose belief in like God and Jesus. I don't really know what that means. I don't really do anything. But like, yeah, I'm Christian. I have faith. Well, do you? Yeah, let's take it one step further, though. So some of us, we can see why that's not right. And many of us are saying, okay, you have to do more than just say you're a Christian. But for many of us, we view faith through the lens of faith being like a line that we cross, or almost like a spiritual light switch. And this is probably true if you're kind of from a conservative evangelical background. We talk about kind of crossing the line of faith, and almost always that involves either a prayer that we pray, right? So if you come from like a Baptist world, is praying the sinner's prayer. If you come from other movements, it's more about your faith in baptism and that step. There's other places where every kind of tribe has their different thing, but it's like, hey, once you do that, like, yeah, you're in. You know, is faith, what I want to suggest is this. Faith is not a line we cross. Faith is a life that we live. And to prove this to you, I mean, let me just try to convince you of this. Following proposition. I believe that the earth is flat. Does anyone believe that I believe that? A few of you, yeah. There's one in every crowd. Yeah, okay. Right, so I have just said, right, so let's look at faith. On one hand, we've got, let's think about faith as a triangle. So we have faith, and all faith, we know, has to have some sort of words, some sort of confession, right? I believe that the world is flat, it's a big pancake, and we're all living on it. Okay. But the next thing that you would say is, okay, do you really believe, I know you just said it, but you don't really believe that. You would want to see what I do, right? So the next thing we have is actions. And that's a good way to figure out what someone really believes. In fact, true story, you can Google this. There was a gentleman who was absolutely convinced that the world was flat. And he believed that all of the simpletons who believe NASA is a big hoax, and he said, here's the way to figure out the problem. I'm going to build a rocket, and I'm going to strap myself to this rocket. I'm going to launch myself up into the atmosphere, and then I will be able to look down and definitively say that the world is a big disk. And he did this, and it was really sad. The rocket exploded, and he died. True story. Now, did that guy believe the world was flat? Well, I don't know. He went a lot more than words. He did something to prove that. And in fact, James, the author, the writer, James, he basically says this in his book. He says, hey, you know what? You can say that you believe all you want. I'm going to show you that I believe by my actions. And we know that that's a part of faith. But there's a third component to faith, which is, I'm going to call it just for the moment, our deepest commitments. Deepest commitments. And this kind of goes, like, we can hear words, we can see actions, but there's a certain element to faith where there's something even more profound going on. And yeah, none of us have perfect words or perfect actions, but there's a sense in which when it comes to a real faith, not one that just was like I checked a box back when I was a little kid, or I kind of believe all of those things. No, like when it comes to a real deep commitment to the gospel. What we see here is faith incorporates all of these things. Yes, you have to profess. There must be a substance to your faith, right? You have to say what you believe. You have to show that you believe that through actions. But also, there's a deeper internal reality when it comes to faith. And in fact, Hebrews says precisely this. It says, "For the word of God is alive and powerful. It's sharper than the sharpest two-edged sword, and it cuts between soul and spirit, between joint and marrow." And here it is. "It exposes our innermost thoughts and desires. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God. Everything is naked and exposed before his eyes, and he is the one to whom we are accountable." That's a vivid picture, isn't it? And what the writer of Hebrews is saying is this is what the gospel does, is it looks right into your soul. And you can't hide. Because this is what God's doing. He is almost like he's like opening us up, and he can see at the end of the day, I know your words, I know your actions, but also the gospel has this way of revealing what it is that we are truly most committed to. And here's the encouraging part. You know, faith is something that God sees in us. Jesus looked over to the thief on the cross. And I don't know what was happening there, but Jesus looked over and he saw faith. God saw Moses and he saw David and all of the other heroes of the Old Testament who were very flawed human beings, but he looked in and he saw faith. When the crowd was gathered at Pentecost and they listened to Peter's sermon, their hearts, right? It says their hearts were pierced and they said, "Brothers, what must we do?" I think what we saw here is God looks at it, he says, "I see faith." Can't fake it, which is great. But it also means you can't fake it. It's something that is it's a reality that is known to God. It's also a genuine response that comes down to the innermost part of our being, and where ultimately says yes to the gospel. And so for us, we're left in this position, and you know, I think, man, I feel like Hebrews is just for us because he's writing to a bunch of Christians. He's writing to them about faith. The most elemental reality of what it means to be a Christian is faith in Jesus, and we're left with this idea of like, what is faith? Are we really deeply committed? Are our actions, are our words, are they all pointing to the gospel? Knowing, of course, that it's not about you might think that's, well, you have to just try really hard. No, our faith is ultimately in Jesus and the work that he does, right? And when we have a genuine response of faith, all that Jesus has done is credited to us. So it's not about perfectly doing all of this. Remember, we're beginning here with grace and God's undeserved favor. But there is this question for us that we have to struggle with. Have we really responded to the gospel in faith? And not would someone say that about you, but I'm just saying if God's able to peel back your soul and your spirit and separating joint from marrow, what does he see? And many of us, we've been given the dual blessing and curse of being raised in Christian homes, going to Christian churches with Christian families. And you've been raised in a faith, and that's great, and all things being equal, I wish everyone had that experience. But there can also be a danger to that, where like, you're like, yeah, of course I believe. You know, I grew up in a Christian home. How many testimonies start with that? That's my testimony. And then, you know, I prayed a prayer, responded to an altar call, all of which are great. Many of us, we've been baptized. All of those things are essential. And even when we see in the New Testament, we see the normative response to faith is repentance from sin and baptism. Right? So I've said things, I've done things, but what it comes down to it is that your true deepest commitment. And for some of us, I wonder if we have failed to enter into rest because we can say that maybe parts of these things are active, but we maybe like checked a box of faith. Maybe it's somewhat we crossed a line of faith, but we haven't really lived a life of faith. And that's what the writer of Hebrews wants for us. He says, I want you to experience God's rest. I don't want you, through disbelief or disregard, to miss out on what God has for you. And I want you to get there, but you've got to persevere through the wilderness, and we're in a wilderness, my friends. We are living with the promise of the cross and also the promise of eternity, and we're right in the middle, and it's difficult. And Hebrews is telling us he wants us to finish strong, but we only do that through faith, which is more than words. It's more than actions. It's words and actions and your deepest commitments. And so this is a moment for all of us to ponder the question. If God can open you up and see into the deepest parts of you, what does he see? And maybe he sees in you faith. And maybe from a young age, or maybe later in life, you heard the gospel and you responded, and all of these things are true, and not perfect, but they're true. And we say that God, man, he sees, and that's what he sees. For some of us, we might just be coming to the realization that, wow, I have words. I probably even have some actions, because here you are doing things that a lot of Christians do. But when it comes down to it, man, I've never really allowed my faith to come down to this level, between soul and spirit. And if that's you, I have good news. Because rest is a promise that still stands, and it's a promise for today. And so if that's you today, I want to take a moment, and I want you to think about it. I want you to allow the gospel to pierce into your innermost thoughts and desires, and ask your question, does that describe me? Or have I been doing a good job of living a pretty good life? At least verbally, or maybe mentally assenting to some of the truths of the Bible, but I haven't really exhibited a life of faith. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a moment, and then I'm going to pray for us. And if that's you, you can respond today. And in fact, we just got to see a student to do that in our worship service. When someone enters the water of baptism, it's not a special ritual that if you do that, you're automatically saved, right? It comes down to faith. But we see that the normative response to faith is repentance of sin. So we say, I've chosen to make God the center of my life. Jesus is my Lord, which means I do what Jesus says, not what I want. And I follow Jesus in baptism. We see that there's something beautiful that happens in baptism, where there's many, many biblical analogies where our sin is washed clean. We become a new man, like the old man is buried and dead, and we rise to new life with Christ. There's many, many analogies, but one of the things it does is it tells the world, I've placed my faith in Christ. And so today, let's take a moment and bow in prayer, and let's talk to God about it. God, we thank you for this teaching. We thank you for the beautiful and profound truth of the gospel that we have received today. God, as I think about what it means to live a life of faith, I'm so enamored with the beauty and the mystery. God, we first of all realize that we desperately are in need of a Savior, that we are in need of someone to redeem us from a life of sin and disobedience. And God, today we are reminded that we find that redemption in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And God, today as we think about his death and resurrection, we want to thank you for the ability to respond to that good news in faith. But God, many of us know that for us, sometimes we can take faith and we can cheapen it. We can make it into a spiritual box that we check, some sort of abstract notion of belief. But God, today we see that it's much more profound than that. It is a deep and innermost commitment. It's even our desires being changed for the things of God and towards the gospel. And God, for many of us, maybe that's all of our story in the room today, but perhaps there's people today and maybe they would say that doesn't describe them. Maybe they're in a position where they've been far from you and they've never, forget about actions or commitments, they've never even said the words or made the profession of belief. And so, God, I'm thankful for those people today. And if there are people here, I pray that you would be working on them right now through the power of the Spirit, convicting them of the truth of the gospel and of the need for repentance from sin. But God, I also realize that today there may be other people in the room, maybe even a larger portion of us, where we've grown up in church or we've had connection to faith in some way. And maybe our story is that we've said all the right things, and again, we've even done some of the right things, but when it comes right down to it, on a soul level, we might have doubts or questions about whether we really are there yet. I pray the same prayer. Would you send your Spirit and convict us? Give us just a desire for you. Give us a desire for the truth of the gospel and for the Spirit to indwell every part of our lives. So God, we thank you that we can do this today, and that we can take a step of faith, knowing that it's ultimately the object of our faith, Jesus, who saves us. So God, we thank you for that today. And we thank you in the name of Jesus. Amen.